I am Staff Sergeant Emily Carter, a former soldier in the United States Army. I thought the training had taught me everything I needed to face an enemy. I was wrong. The hardest fight came home. The threat did not wear a uniform or carry a rifle. He sat in my mother's living room, a man who called himself family. Worse still, my mother, who should have been my first line of defense, chose to look away. That moment cracked something inside me, a truth I could no longer ignore. Before we dive into the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if stories of courage and resilience speak to you. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what hour it is in your corner of the world. There's something quietly powerful about seeing how far these stories travel and whose hearts they touch. If you have walked through your own battlefield, you will know why belonging matters more than applause. When I returned from my last deployment, I did not come home to peace. I brought a backpack and a checklist, and I turned my small apartment into a war room. Photos, receipts, printed emails, a faded flag that should have been safe, all tacked to cork and linked with red thread. A college fund vanished, a prom ruined, private conversations rewritten into public smears. This was not random cruelty. It was an orchestrated campaign to erase me. I am a soldier by training and a witness by fate. This is how I decided to respond. Chapter 1: Childhood Scars. Part 1. I was 10 years old the first time Victor slapped me hard enough to leave a handprint on my cheek. I remember the sting of it more than the sound, the hot burn of skin on skin, and the way the room seemed to shrink after it happened. He was not yelling. He rarely did. He believed in quiet punishments, sudden and sharp, like a snake striking from the grass. My mother, Clara, was standing in the kitchen doorway holding a dish towel. She looked at me, then looked away. That was the first scar, not the slap itself, but the silence that followed it. Silence has a weight. It presses down heavier than words ever could. When Victor punished me, his voice was steady, his expression calm. He could have been correcting a dog or adjusting a crooked picture on the wall. My mother's silence told me something worse. She was not surprised. She had decided long before that my pain was less important than her peace. That knowledge cut deeper than his hand ever could. By the time I was 12, I had grown skilled at hiding bruises, long sleeves in summer, hoodies zipped up tight no matter the weather. At school, I told my teachers I was clumsy, that I tripped over my own feet. Kids laughed about it. They called me accident-prone, the girl who always found a way to fall. What they didn't know was that I had learned how to fall on purpose, to angle my body so when Victor's shove came, I could crash against something that would bruise but not break. I learned tactics like that early, the way other kids learned multiplication tables or how to ride a bike. But one night, the tactics failed. It was late October, the air cold enough that you could see your breath outside. I had been caught sneaking a paperback into bed, flashlight under the covers. A soldier's daughter in training without knowing it, already learning how to hide contraband. Victor yanked the book from my hand and accused me of disrespect. I argued back. That was my mistake. The next thing I knew, his fist drove into my side, just below the ribs. Pain bloomed white hot, and for a moment I could not breathe. I crumpled to the floor, clutching my chest. The crack was audible. I knew something inside me had broken. My body refused to expand enough to take in air. Panic clawed at me as much as the pain. And then there was Clara. She stood in the doorway again, the same dish towel in her hand, her lips parted like she wanted to say something but didn't. Her silence was the confirmation. I was on my own. They did not take me to a hospital. Victor said it was a bruise. Clara iced my side, muttering about how I should not have talked back. I spent 3 weeks breathing shallow, curling into myself each night, terrified of coughing because every cough sent lightning bolts through my chest. My ribs healed crooked. I still feel the ache when the weather turns cold. But worse than the ache was the truth that set in during those long nights staring at the ceiling. I understood that in my mother's eyes, I was not a daughter to protect. I was an inconvenience to manage. That broken rib became the ghost that followed me everywhere. Every time I straightened my spine and pulled back my shoulders in formation years later, I could feel the memory of that pain. Every time I heard the sharp crack of a rifle in training, my body flinched with the echo of another crack in a small, dark bedroom. It is strange how one night can echo for decades, how it can shape the way you carry yourself, even in a uniform designed to make you feel strong. Growing up in Victor's house was like living in occupied territory. You memorized his rules the way soldiers memorize standard operating procedures. Do not speak unless spoken to. Keep your eyes lowered. Never leave food on your plate. Keep the remote control on the coffee table, aligned perfectly with the edge. The smallest violation meant punishment. My mother helped enforce the rules. She rarely raised her voice, but she watched me with the eyes of someone waiting for me to slip, ready to hand me over to the man who believed order came from fear. Sometimes I wondered if she loved him more than she loved me. Other times I wondered if she loved anyone at all. Her affection was a currency she never spent on me. Instead, she gave it freely to my younger brother, Nathan. To him, she was all warmth, sweet words, gentle touches. With me, she was ice. It took me years to realize that Nathan's role was the golden child, mine the scapegoat. A family unit balanced on cruelty and favoritism, each of us trapped in the part she assigned. The cruelty never left me, but it also never defined me completely, even at 12. Lying on my bed with my ribs wrapped tight in makeshift bandages, I imagined a different kind of life. Somewhere out there, I believed there was a place where strength was respected, where rules were fair, where brothers and sisters had each other's backs instead of watching one another fall. I clung to that idea like a lifeline. I found that place years later when I raised my right hand and swore my oath to the United States Army. The decision to enlist came as naturally as breathing. Some kids dream of college, some dream of escape through marriage or a job far from home. For me, the Army was both escape and destiny. I wanted discipline, yes, but not the twisted version Victor had used against me. I wanted the real kind, the kind built on honor and structure. I wanted to know what it felt like to be valued for what I could endure, for what I could contribute. The day I stepped onto the bus for basic training, I felt lighter than I had ever felt. My mother barely said goodbye. Victor smirked like he thought I would wash out within weeks, but I knew better. The Army was not going to break me. It was going to show me who I really was. At Fort Jackson, I discovered what it meant to belong to something larger than yourself. The drill sergeants barked commands and we moved as one. Sweat poured down our backs, boots pounded the dirt in unison, and for the first time in my life, pain meant progress. Every blister, every strained muscle. Every moment I thought I might collapse was a reminder that I was no longer a victim. I was a soldier in the making. When the training got brutal, I thought of that broken rib. If I had survived Victor, I could survive this. If I could hold my silence while my own mother looked away, I could hold a push-up position until my arms shook. The Army did not frighten me, it freed me, but freedom comes at a price. And no matter how many miles I marched or how many medals I earned, the past did not stay buried. The scars followed me, visible only to me but sharp enough to cut. I was not the fastest runner in my platoon, nor the sharpest shot at first. What I had was something harder to measure: endurance, a bone-deep refusal to quit. While others collapsed in the South Carolina heat, I kept moving. Every drop of sweat felt like proof that I had survived worse and would survive again. My drill sergeants noticed. They called me stubborn in a way that almost sounded like praise. There was one night during basic that tested me more than any other. We were out on the range for night fire exercises. The air smelled of gunpowder and sweat, the sky a heavy black. The crack of rifles echoed through the dark, sharp and sudden. Each sound hit me like a ghost. I flinched before I could stop myself, my body remembering another crack from years earlier in a dim bedroom. A rib snapping, breath stolen. For a moment, the past and present blurred and panic surged. I forced myself to breathe, to steady my aim. To press the trigger anyway. The round hit its target. The panic faded. I told myself the truth I had always known deep down. Victor had hurt me, but he had not broken me. That rib healed crooked, but it carried me here. Every shot I fired from then on felt like reclaiming ground he had once stolen. By graduation, I stood straighter than I ever had before. My uniform fit like armor, but it was more than fabric and seams. It was belonging. It was the difference between being invisible in my mother's kitchen and being seen on a parade field, my name called with respect. I had traded silence for voice, shame for strength. Yet even in that moment of triumph, I carried the knowledge that scars do not vanish. They become part of your story, etched deep enough that no metal can erase them. The Army gave me more than discipline. It gave me family. My battle buddies were sisters and brothers in every sense that Victor and Clara had never understood. They had my back in the field, shared rations with me when supplies ran low, and laughed with me in the barracks when exhaustion made everything ridiculous. With them, I was not the scapegoat. I was Emily, soldier, dependable, tough, someone they could count on when things got bad. But nights were hardest. Lying in the dark, the barracks quiet around me, memories crept in. I would hear a boot scuff against the floor and my body tensed, waiting for the next blow. I would dream of Clara standing in the doorway, her lips parted, her eyes refusing to meet mine. I woke sweating, fists clenched, ready to fight shadows that never came. That was when I realized that training your body was one thing, training your mind to believe you were safe was another. I volunteered for extra duty whenever I could. The more I pushed myself, the less space there was for memories to take root. My commanding officer noticed my willingness, and by the time I deployed overseas, I had built a reputation for resilience. I wore that reputation like a second uniform. Out there under a foreign sun, surrounded by men and women who depended on me, I felt stronger than I ever had, and still, in the quiet between missions, the ghosts of childhood returned. I never told anyone the full story. To admit the past felt like admitting weakness, and weakness was something I could not afford. Instead, I built a wall of silence, brick by brick, the same way I had when I was 12. But walls are not impenetrable. Sometimes they crack. One evening, after a long patrol, my friend Jasmine Morales sat beside me cleaning her weapon. She glanced at the faint scar along my ribcage, just visible under my PT shirt. She asked what had happened. I could have lied. I almost did. Instead, I told her the truth, or part of it. I said I had broken a rib as a kid, left untreated, and it still ached sometimes. She nodded, no judgment. Only understanding. That small moment mattered more than I realized. It was the first time I had shared even a piece of my burden. Jasmine told me later that she admired how I carried myself, how nothing seemed to shake me. I wanted to laugh. If only she knew the weight I dragged behind me, the nights I spent staring at the ceiling fighting old battles. But maybe that was the point. Strength is not about never breaking. It is about breaking and then standing up anyway. Years passed, deployments came and went. I learned to lead, to trust my instincts, to fight alongside people who became closer than blood. I earned promotions, commendations, respect. And yet every time I returned stateside, stepping into that childhood house felt like walking back into enemy territory. Victor still sat in the living room, remote control aligned just so on the coffee table. Clara still watched in silence, her eyes as cold as they had ever been. I was a staff sergeant, a decorated soldier, but in their presence, I was still the girl with a crooked rib. That contradiction ate at me. How could I face enemies abroad and still feel powerless in my own home? How could I train others to fight when I had not truly confronted the war that began in my childhood? I realized then that survival was not enough. Endurance was not enough. If I was ever going to be free, I would need to fight the battle I had avoided for years. That night, as I packed my duffel for another rotation, I placed my medals carefully in their case. I looked at the reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back at me was a soldier, yes, but also a survivor of another kind of battlefield. My scars were not just reminders, they were evidence that I had lived, endured, and could choose to rise. I promised myself that when the time came, I would not be silent anymore. I would not flinch when the past cracked through the dark. I would face it head on, the way I had been trained to face every mission. And this time, the battleground would not be a desert overseas, it would be a courtroom. It would be the war room I would build in my own apartment. It would be justice long overdue. Looking back, I understand that chapter 1 of my life did not end in childhood. It followed me into every uniform inspection, every patrol, every quiet moment in the barracks. It shaped the soldier I became, but it also gave me the grit to keep standing, to keep believing that even in the darkest places, there is a way forward. Scars can be chains or they can be fuel. I chose fuel. And that choice is what carried me into the next part of my story. When I left the army, people congratulated me for my service. They thanked me in airports, shook my hand at gas stations, and smiled when they saw the veteran plates on my car. What they did not know was that the hardest mission was still ahead of me. It was not on foreign soil. It was in the same small town where I had once been a girl with a crooked rib, the same house where silence had been more dangerous than fists. I told myself that returning home was a practical decision. I needed to collect what was mine. My father had died young, a man I barely remembered, but he left behind symbols that mattered to me more than anything Victor or Clara could touch. A folded flag from his funeral, a handful of medals earned in his own service. They were proof that honor lived in my blood, that strength ran deeper than cruelty. I thought if I could hold those items in my hands, I would anchor myself to a legacy larger than scars. The day I walked back into that house, I was no longer a frightened child. I was Staff Sergeant Emily Carter, veteran of 2 deployments, graduate of every grueling course the Army had to offer. My boots echoed on the same hardwood floor that had once been a battlefield of a different kind. Clara greeted me with a polite smile, too sweet to be real, as if I were a guest instead of her daughter. Victor barely looked up from his recliner. I went straight to the hall closet where the keepsake trunk had always been. I opened it, my breath already caught in my chest, empty. The flag, the medals, the photographs of my father all gone. What remained were scraps, a couple of worn blankets, an old shoe box filled with receipts. My first thought was disbelief. Maybe Clara had moved the items for safekeeping. Maybe they were in the attic. But the look in her eyes told me otherwise. Cold, flat, without apology. She knew what I was searching for, and she knew I would not find it. I asked her directly. She shrugged, said she could not remember where the box had gone. Victor chuckled under his breath. That sound sent heat rushing through me faster than any drill sergeant ever had. The realization landed like a blow. Those pieces of my father had been erased. Not by accident, not by time, by choice, that night. Back in my apartment, I stared at the blank walls. I felt the same suffocating silence I had known at 12. But this time, I had the tools to fight back. I pulled out a corkboard, some push pins, and red thread. If my life had been a campaign, then this was my after-action report. Every soldier knows the drill. You break down what happened, identify failures, gather evidence, and prepare for the next mission. Exhibit A was obvious, missing property. The flag, the medals, the photographs, stolen or destroyed, but either way gone. Exhibit B came into focus as I dug through old bank statements. The college fund my father had set aside for me had vanished years earlier. Clara claimed she used it for bills, but the timing lined up with Victor's new truck, the one he drove around town like a prize. That fund had been my ticket out, a bridge to a future. Instead, I had signed enlistment papers at 17 because there was no money left. I did not regret the Army. It made me who I was, but the theft still burned. Exhibit C surfaced as I reconnected with people from home. Former teachers, neighbors, even Jasmine from my unit who had fielded strange calls while we were still in training. Clara had been busy behind the scenes, painting me as unstable, unreliable, untrustworthy. Whispers that I was violent, that I struggled with my mind, that I should not be trusted with responsibility. Those rumors had cost me friendships, opportunities, maybe more. Piece by piece, the pattern revealed itself. This was not neglect, it was sabotage. A campaign to erase my father's memory, to drain my future, to isolate me until I doubted my own worth. And Clara had been the architect. Victor provided the fists, but she provided the silence, the excuses, the lies that gave his cruelty cover. The realization hit harder than any blow. She was not just complicit, she was a participant. I pinned each piece of evidence to the board. Red string connected them like veins across the wall. The war room grew day by day. Receipts, phone records, notes scribbled on yellow paper. My apartment looked less like a home and more like an intelligence cell, but for the first time I felt clarity. Soldiers study the battlefield before they strike. This was my battlefield. What surprised me most was the calm. Anger had been there at first, hot and bright, but what replaced it was colder, determined. I had learned long ago that rage burns fast and leaves you empty. Strategy lasts, strategy wins. Each night I stood before the board, reviewing my exhibits, my own private after-action report. Exhibit A, stolen legacy. Exhibit B, stolen future. Exhibit C, stolen reputation. Together they formed a clear mission statement. My task was no longer survival, it was reclamation. Still, there were moments when the weight felt unbearable. I would hold an empty picture frame, once filled with my father's face, and grief would rise like a tide. Or I would see an old classmate post about law school and remember the fun that had vanished, the years I could never get back. The ache was sharp, but I refused to let it paralyze me. In the Army, we learned to fight tired, fight hungry, fight scared. You fought anyway. The The hardest part was admitting that the enemy was not just Victor. I had always known his role, but facing Clara's betrayal required a different kind of courage. To accept that your own mother had chosen to erase you is a wound deeper than broken bones. It was the wound that shaped every scar that followed. I began to write everything down, not in the language of diary entries, but in reports. Clear, concise, factual, times, dates, incidents, corroborating details. If I was going to win this battle, I needed evidence that would hold up beyond my own memory. I needed to build a case, not just a story. That habit saved me. When grief threatened to pull me under, the act of writing gave me structure. When anger tempted me to lash out, the report steadied me. Line by line, I transformed chaos into order, trauma into testimony. The war room became my sanctuary, a place where the past could not twist itself into confusion anymore, where gaslighting had no power, where every scar had a name and every wound had a record. I knew this was only the beginning. Soldiers never stop at the after-action report. The point is to prepare for what comes next, and what came next would require more than evidence. It would require allies. Once the first wave of evidence was pinned to my wall, I realized I had only scratched the surface. Soldiers are trained never to assume. You verify, you corroborate, you gather intelligence until the picture is too clear to ignore. My exhibits were strong, but I knew that alone they would be dismissed as the bitter words of a daughter with a grudge. I needed proof beyond myself. I began with neighbors. The Carsons had lived next door for 20 years, Mr. Carson was a retired postal worker, the kind of man who noticed everything. I stopped by under the pretense of catching up. His wife served me coffee, the same chipped mugs I remembered from childhood. When I asked about the years I was away, his expression tightened. He hesitated, then said he had often heard shouting through the walls. He admitted he once thought of calling the police, but Clara had come over the next day with a smile and a pie, assuring them everything was fine. His words were careful, but the meaning was clear. They had known something was wrong, but Clara had smoothed it over, silencing concern before it became action. That was my first external confirmation. Exhibit D, corroboration of household violence, obscured by Clara's deliberate charm. Next, I reached out to one of my old teachers, Mrs. Lane, who had always encouraged me. She remembered my endless hoodies, my excuses about falling downstairs. She told me she had once scheduled a meeting with Clara to discuss her worries. Clara had arrived in pearls and lipstick, presenting herself as the picture of a caring mother. She told Mrs. Lane I was dramatic, prone to exaggeration, and struggling with adolescent anger. Mrs. Lane admitted she had believed her. She said it with tears in her eyes, regret heavy in her voice. Exhibit E, a trusted authority manipulated into silence. I kept building phone records. I pulled my own logs from years back, some still stored online. I found numbers that matched Clara's phone calling Jasmine while we were in training. Jasmine confirmed that Clara had told her I was unstable, that I might lash out, that she should keep her distance. Jasmine had ignored it, thank God, but the attempt was undeniable. Exhibit F, documented interference in military relationships. Piece by piece, the puzzle formed. Clara had not been a passive bystander. She had been active. She had chosen lies over truth, appearance over justice, control over love. One night, staring at the red threads webbing across my wall, I realized how familiar it looked. It was an intelligence map, the kind we built overseas, connecting insurgent leaders, identifying networks of influence. Except this was not Iraq or Afghanistan. This was my childhood home. My insurgent network had only two names at the center, Victor and Clara. The more I uncovered, the more dangerous it felt. Victor was predictable in his cruelty. Clara was insidious in hers. She could smile at a neighbor while erasing me behind the scenes. She could charm a teacher while dismissing my pain. That kind of manipulation left scars deeper than fists. It taught me to question my own reality, to wonder if maybe I deserved what happened. Untangling those lies was harder than any obstacle course I had ever run. But clarity is its own weapon, and I was arming myself. I began scanning old photographs. At first, I thought it was nostalgia, but then I noticed patterns. In pictures with Nathan, Clara always leaned close, her hand resting on his shoulder. With me, she kept distance, her body angled away. In family portraits, Victor's hand rested heavy on my shoulder, almost possessive, while Clara looked at the camera with that same frozen smile. Each image was another piece of evidence, another subtle testimony of where her loyalties lay. Exhibit G: visual patterns of favoritism and neglect. My war room grew crowded. Friends who visited thought I had lost myself in obsession. Maybe I had, but obsession in the service of truth is not madness, it is mission. The final piece came from a box in the attic. Clara had forgotten to clear it out. Inside were old letters, bills, a stack of envelopes tied with twine. Among them was a bank notice from the year the college fund disappeared. Withdrawals made in Clara's handwriting, signed checks deposited into Victor's account. The paper was yellowed with age, but it was solid evidence. Exhibit H: financial theft documented. I sat on the attic floor holding that slip of paper, my hands trembling. It was the smoking gun. For years I had believed she simply looked away. Now I held proof she had not only condoned the theft, but orchestrated it. I thought about all the nights I had blamed myself for not being enough, for not being lovable, for not earning her protection. The truth was both crushing and liberating. It was never about me. It was about her choices. Choices that spoke louder than any slap, any silence. That night I added the bank slip to the center of the board. The web of red threads pulsed under the lamplight like veins. For the first time, I allowed myself to whisper the truth out loud. My mother betrayed me. The words tasted like ash, but they were real. The next morning, I began drafting a new section of the report. This was not just an after-action review of what had happened. It was preparation for a counteroffensive. In the Army, you do not just study what went wrong. You design the next mission. My mission was justice. I knew I could not do it alone. A soldier without a unit is vulnerable. I had built the map, gathered the intel, documented the evidence. The next step was to find allies who could stand with me when the time came. Allies who could validate my story, back me up in the fight ahead, and remind me that I was no longer 12 years old gasping for air on a bedroom floor, standing before the war room. I felt the shift inside me. I was not the broken child anymore. I was a veteran, a strategist, a survivor armed with facts, not just memories. Clara and Victor had built a fortress of lies around themselves, but I had built something stronger. The after-action report was complete. The mission ahead was clear. It was time to move from intelligence gathering to mobilization. It was time to call in reinforcements. The after-action report had given me clarity, but clarity alone does not win battles. Every soldier knows that you need a unit, a team, someone watching your back when you push forward into hostile ground. Alone, I had evidence pinned on a board. With allies, I could turn that evidence into undeniable truth. The first person I reached out to was Jasmine Morales. We had called her Jazz from the first week of basic. She was the kind of woman who laughed in the face of exhaustion, who could carry a rucksack twice her size and still be the first to crack a joke around the fire. In training, she had been more than a friend. She had been a lifeline. I drove 3 hours to the small town where she lived now, the road winding through fields that seemed to stretch forever. When I knocked on her door, she opened it with the same wide grin I remembered. The years fell away in an instant. She pulled me into a hug that felt like coming home. Over dinner, we talked about everything and nothing. About deployments, about people we had lost touch with, about the ways civilian life never quite fit after the Army. Then I told her why I was there. Her smile faded as I laid out the story. The missing flag, the stolen fund, the phone calls. Her eyes sharpened with recognition. She set down her fork, leaned forward, and said she remembered. Back in basic. She had gotten a call from a number she did not know. On the line was a woman who introduced herself as my mother. The woman had said I was unstable, prone to violent outbursts, and that Jazz should keep her distance. Jazz had brushed it off at the time, thinking it was some kind of overprotective parent, but hearing it now, she realized what it really was. She agreed to write a statement. She even pulled up her old cell records, still saved in her account, showing the number that matched Clara's phone. It was like finding a match to light a fuse. I was not imagining things. I was not rewriting the past. It had happened, and now I had someone willing to stand beside me and say so. Driving home that night, I felt something I had not felt in a long time. Relief, not the kind that comes from escaping danger, but the kind that comes when someone finally says, "I believe you." But I knew I needed more. The next person on my list was Captain Grace Thompson, retired Marine Corps. She had been one of the hardest officers I had ever trained under. She pushed us beyond exhaustion, demanded precision in every movement, every report. At the time, I thought she was impossible to please. But looking back, I realized she had been shaping us into something stronger than we knew we could be. Finding her took weeks. She had retired quietly, living out on the coast, far from the noise of bases and barracks. When I finally reached her by phone, her voice was the same as I remembered. Sharp, no nonsense. With a layer of warmth buried deep, she agreed to meet. We sat on her porch overlooking the sea, the waves breaking steady against the rocks. She listened as I told my story. She did not interrupt, only nodded slowly, her eyes narrowing as the pieces fell into place. Then she stood, went inside, and returned with a battered laptop. She pulled up an old email archive, and there it was. A message from Clara, sent years ago, addressed to her directly. The words chilled me even though I had long suspected their existence. Clara had written that I was unstable, that I suffered from mental health issues, that I should not be trusted with responsibility. She had asked Grace to keep me under close watch, to limit my opportunities. I felt my stomach twist. Grace looked at me with steady eyes. She said she had never believed it. She had seen my discipline, my strength, my refusal to quit. She had kept the email not because she believed it, but because she had sensed one day it might matter. Now, years later, it was Exhibit I in my war room. When I asked her if she would testify, her answer was simple. Yes, she said the truth deserves a voice, and she would not let a lie stand unchallenged. I left her porch with the sea wind in my hair and a weight lifted from my shoulders. I had gone there alone, carrying years of silence, and walked away with proof in hand and a commander at my back. That night, standing in front of my war room, I added the new pieces. The phone record from Jazz, the statement she promised, the email from Clara, now printed and pinned dead center on the board. The red threads stretched tighter, the map growing clearer. It struck me then that this was not just about my childhood anymore. It was not about a broken rib or an empty bank account. It was about truth versus deception. It was about how lies can shape a life if left unchecked. And it was about how reclaiming the truth takes more than one voice. This was no longer a family feud. It was an information war. The tactics Clara had used were familiar now that I looked at them through a soldier's eyes. Disinformation, character assassination, divide and isolate. They were the same strategies we had studied in counterinsurgency. She had waged her campaign quietly, effectively, leaving me to question myself while others believed her facade. But the same principles apply on both battlefields. Once the truth is exposed, once allies stand together, lies lose their power. I slept better that night than I had in years. The ghosts were still there, but they were quieter, because for the first time, I knew I was not standing alone. The night after I added Grace's email to my board, I sat in the dark staring at the red threads. They glowed in the lamplight like arteries, pumping a new kind of life into my mission. For years, I had carried the weight of silence. Now the silence was breaking, and with every new voice that joined mine, the burden grew lighter. The next morning, I called Jasmine. Hearing her laugh on the other end of the line steadied me. She told me she had already drafted her statement. Detailed and precise. She had even included the way Clara introduced herself, the exact phrases she used. Reading it out loud, Jasmine's voice grew firmer, almost angry. She said she had not realized back then how insidious it had been, how calculated. She promised she would testify if it came to that. I thanked her, and when I hung up, tears blurred the war room into a haze of red and white. It was not sadness. It was something close to gratitude. Sharp and overwhelming, to be believed is to be seen, and for the first time in years, I felt visible. I knew I needed to widen the net, so I reached out to Mrs. Lane, my old teacher, again. She had already confessed her regret for believing Clara's act. This time I asked if she would write a letter describing that meeting, what Clara had said, and how she had manipulated her perception. Mrs. Lane hesitated. She was older now, her health fragile, her voice uncertain. But then she said she owed it to me, and more than that, she owed it to the girl she had once failed to protect. She mailed the letter 2 weeks later. When it arrived, I held the envelope in my hands for a long time before opening it. Her words were shaky but strong enough to matter. Exhibit J, testimony from an educator manipulated into silence. Every new piece of evidence felt like a brick placed on my side of the scale, balancing years of injustice. The weight was shifting, but allies were not just about paper or statements, they were about presence. I needed people who could stand with me when confrontation came, who could look Victor and Clara in the eye and refuse to be swayed. One evening, I drove out to meet an old sergeant from my unit, Mark Rivers. He had seen me under fire, had watched me steady others when fear nearly broke them. Over beers in a dim bar, I told him the story. He listened without interruption, his eyes never leaving mine. When I finished, he set his glass down hard on the table. He said anyone who tried to erase a soldier's honor deserved to face the consequences. He offered to connect me with a veterans legal network he volunteered with. They specialized in cases where service members were defamed or exploited. That contact became the bridge to something bigger than I had imagined. Through the network, I met other veterans who had faced similar betrayals by family, people who had stolen benefits, spread lies, or left scars unseen by the public eye. Their stories mirrored mine in haunting ways. One woman told me her own brother had siphoned off her deployment pay. Another man said his father had convinced neighbors he was addicted to drugs when in truth he had been clean for years. Each testimony was another reminder that my battle was not unique. It was part of a wider war. Hearing those stories filled me with something fierce. Anger, yes, but also purpose. I was not fighting only for myself anymore. I was fighting for every soldier whose voice had been smothered by lies. Back in my apartment, the war room expanded. Letters, statements, printouts, even photos from the veterans group pinned beside my own. It was not just my battle map anymore. It was a testament to resilience, a reminder that the fight for truth is collective. But with each new ally, I felt the emotional weight deepen. Being believed was powerful, but it also stirred grief I had kept buried. Each time someone confirmed Clara's manipulation, I felt the echo of that little girl waiting for her mother to intervene. Knowing she never had, never would, cut me all over again. It is one thing to suspect betrayal. It is another to have it proven. I found myself pacing at night, unable to sleep, torn between relief and sorrow. Sometimes I held the folded letter from Mrs. Lane, reading her apology until the words blurred. Sometimes I replayed Jasmine's voice in my head, fierce with anger on my behalf. Those echoes were balm and blade at once. In those restless nights, I reminded myself what the Army had taught me. You can carry grief and still keep moving. You can feel sorrow and still advance. Strength is not the absence of pain. It is the decision to keep marching despite it. By the time winter settled in, I had built a coalition. Jasmine, Mrs. Lane, Sergeant Rivers, and the Veterans Legal Group. Even the Carsons, who had finally agreed to give a statement about the shouting through the walls. My allies came from different corners of my life, but together they formed a unit as solid as any I had marched with. I looked at my board one night, the evidence spread wide, the names of my allies written on yellow cards pinned along the edges. For the first time, the red threads did not look like a tangle. They looked like strategy, like a plan forming, a campaign ready to unfold. That was when I knew it was time to move from intelligence to action, from gathering to deployment, from silence to voice. I sat down at my desk and began drafting the opening lines of a new report, not an after-action review this time, a mission plan. Phase 1 was complete. Phase 2 would mean stepping into the open, confronting Clara and Victor not just with memory, but with evidence, allies, and strategy. The legal path would be the next battlefield. I was under no illusion that it would be easy. Courtrooms are their own kind of fought not with rifles, but with words and paper. Still, the principles are the same: preparation, discipline, courage, and allies who will not let you fall. I closed my notebook that night with a quiet sense of resolve. The girl who had once lain gasping on the bedroom floor was gone. In her place stood a veteran with a unit at her back. The mission was clear, the target defined. The next chapter of the fight was about to begin. When I walked into the Veteran Legal Network's office, I expected another conference room, another polite nod, another lawyer reciting fees and timelines. Instead, I met Marcus Hale. He was tall, built like the soldier he once was, his posture still carrying the precision of the Army Rangers. His eyes were sharp, scanning me with the same quiet calculation I remembered from officers before a mission brief. They called him the Hawk, and within 5 minutes I understood why. He missed nothing. I laid out my after-action report across the table. Statements, emails, phone records, financial slips, photographs. He studied each piece in silence, his finger tapping the edge of the bank document that showed Clara's signature. Finally, he looked up and said I had enough for campaign, but campaigns do not win on paper alone. They win with timing, with witness reliability, and with patience. That word, campaign, stirred something in me. This was no longer about surviving memory. This was about launching a counteroffensive. Marcus explained the plan with the ease of a ranger setting coordinates. First, consolidate evidence into categories: financial theft, defamation, surveillance. Second, secure fresh material through recordings and corroborations. Third, prepare for escalation: depositions, subpoenas, possibly court. He emphasized that lies unravel fastest under light. My job, he said, was to keep my discipline. His job was to aim the evidence like an arrow. I agreed, and we shook hands. His grip was firm, not just professional, but personal. I sensed that for him, this was not just another case, it was a mission. The first stage was gathering more proof. Marcus suggested I stay at my mother's house for a few days under the pretense of reconciling. He wanted me to observe, to document anything suspicious, to keep my phone recording discreetly. The thought made my stomach tighten, but I knew he was right. We needed present-day evidence, not just history. So I packed a small bag and drove back to the house I once called home. Clara greeted me with exaggerated warmth, arms open, a smile too wide. Victor hung back, quieter than I remembered, his eyes avoiding mine. It struck me that age had dulled his cruelty. His shoulders slumped, his hands shook faintly when he lifted a glass. The fists that had once broken my ribs were now useless. But Clara was different. Her voice was smoother, her grip on the household tighter. The battlefield had shifted. Victor was no longer the blunt weapon. Clara had become the strategist. The first night, I lay awake in my old room. It looked untouched at first glance, but there was a strangeness to it. The books on the shelf were arranged too neatly. The picture frame on the dresser faced not toward the bed, but toward the door. Something was off. The second morning, I noticed a faint glint above the curtain rod. I stood on a chair, pulled it down, and there it was, a small hidden camera. My hands trembled as I held it, proof, not of past blows, but of present violation. Clara had placed eyes in my room, watching, recording. This was not negligence, this was control. I took photos, cataloged the device, and called Marcus immediately. His voice did not waver. He told me to leave it in place, to continue acting normal, but to record every discovery. This was Exhibit K, he said, and it was strong. That night at dinner, I studied Clara. She chatted about neighbors, about the garden, about Victor's health. Her smile never faltered, but behind her eyes I saw calculation. She believed she was still in control, still scripting the narrative. She did not know I had shifted from survivor to strategist. In the days that followed, I kept my composure. I helped with dishes, listened to her stories, nodded when she spoke. But every night I documented, recorded, wrote. The hawk had taught me to build a dossier. And I was building one brick by brick. Victor stayed mostly silent, his presence shrinking. Once, late at night, I heard him mutter in the hallway. His words were fragmented, regret tangled with bitterness. I realized then that he no longer scared me. He was a relic of violence past. Clara, however, was the active threat, the manipulator, the one still pulling strings. On the fourth day, I found another device hidden behind a stack of books, smaller than the first. Almost invisible, Clara had not just watched, she had planned. The realization burned through me. She had learned to wound without raising a hand. Psychological warfare, subtle, relentless. I reported it all to Marcus. He told me we now had a live case of unlawful surveillance, a present-day violation that would anchor the older evidence. He promised me that this changed everything. Sitting in that old room, the camera still humming in the corner. I felt a surge of clarity. My enemy had shifted forms, but my training had prepared me for this. Wars evolve, tactics change. The battlefield is never the same twice, but a soldier adapts. Victor's fists had scarred my childhood. Clara's eyes sought to erase my adulthood, but I was no longer the child they had broken, nor the young recruit struggling to prove herself. I was a veteran, I had allies, I had the hawk, and for the first time I believed I could win. Marcus had a way of speaking that steadied me. Whenever I called with new findings, he reminded me to log the time, date, and exact conditions. Precision was a shield in the legal battlefield. Each detail became a stone in the foundation we were building. After discovering the second hidden camera, I stayed calm in front of Clara. I laughed at her stories, helped her trim roses in the backyard, even asked for recipes she knew I never cared about. The act was draining. But Marcus told me that deception can be a tool when used for survival. I was not lying to protect her anymore. I was collecting intelligence to protect myself. On the fifth morning, I staged a casual phone call in the kitchen. I pretended I was speaking to Jasmine about old times, but in reality, I was fishing. I said out loud that I wished my mother had trusted me when I was young, that I still wondered why she had made those phone calls to my friends. Clara froze at the sink. I caught the flicker in her eyes before she masked it with a smile. Later that day, Marcus instructed me to repeat similar scenarios, always with my recorder running, baiting her to reveal her hand. It worked. On the seventh night, as we cleared dishes, Clara sighed and muttered that she had only ever tried to protect me from myself, that if she had not intervened, others would have seen how unstable I was. The words cut like glass. But I felt the recorder in my pocket and kept my voice steady. That audio became Exhibit L, a present-day admission of defamation. Marcus was pleased but cautious. He said we needed corroboration from a neutral observer. We arranged for a technician from the legal network to come by under the guise of installing a new router. He swept the room and found 2 more cameras, both transmitting to a cloud account tied to Clara's email. The technician documented everything, signed a statement, and delivered the report straight to Marcus. Exhibit M confirmed unlawful surveillance by a licensed specialist. With every piece, the noose tightened. I felt both exhilarated and exhausted. The child in me longed to scream, to confront Clara face to face. The soldier in me knew that patience wins campaigns. Marcus reminded me daily that timing was key. We were building a case that would withstand scrutiny in a courtroom, not just the court of memory. Meanwhile, Victor grew more ghost-like. He shuffled around the house, barely speaking, his once imposing frame reduced to shadows. But Clara spoke for him, hovered over him, steered conversations. It became clear that he no longer had the will or the strength to be the aggressor. Clara was the mind, the architect. She had always been. One afternoon, Marcus and I met in person at the network's office. He spread out the files across the table, arranging them like a battle map. Exhibit A through M, each with dates, witness lists, and legal citations. He outlined the next steps. File a protective order based on surveillance, prepare a civil suit for financial theft, and build a defamation case anchored by the audio recordings and emails. He spoke of depositions, subpoenas, and discovery as if he were describing a tactical raid. His eyes narrowed as he reminded me that once we filed, Clara and Victor would fight back, likely with more lies. But this time, I would not be standing alone. The strategy steadied me. But the night still brought a weight I could not shake. I sat in my apartment staring at the war room, the photos and threads, the printed emails and recorded transcripts. For years, these memories had been mine alone, heavy and isolating. Now they were transformed into evidence, into weapons of truth, yet carrying them was still painful. Sometimes I touched the flag case that should have held my father's colors, the one Victor had taken. The absence burned as much as the presence of scars. In those quiet hours, I found myself writing letters I never sent. One to my father, telling him I was finally fighting back. One to the 12-year-old girl who had lain on the floor gasping for air, promising her she was not forgotten. Those letters steadied me more than sleep. Marcus called often, his voice clipped but reassuring. He said we were weeks from filing, that the evidence was airtight. He urged me to prepare emotionally for confrontation. He reminded me that Clara's smile, her charm, her ability to twist perception would not vanish. She would fight with the same weapons she had always used. But this time we had transcripts, witnesses, and law on our side. I thought of my unit overseas, the way we had leaned on each other when the night grew too long. Now my unit wore civilian clothes, carried briefcases instead of rifles. But the principle was the same. Strength came from solidarity. As the days closed in, I rehearsed what it would mean to face Clara and Victor in a legal setting. I pictured the courtroom, the judge, the rows of seats, the eyes watching. I imagined Clara's practiced expressions, her voice dripping with concern as she lied, and then I imagined my allies rising one by one to speak truth. Jasmine with her phone records, Grace with the archived email, Mrs. Lane with her written testimony, the Carsons with their memories of shouting through the walls, and Marcus, the hawk, steady as stone, guiding the case like a commander at the front. The thought of it both terrified and exhilarated me. Terror because I knew confrontation would rip open wounds. Exhilaration because for the first time the truth would not be mine alone. On the final night before filing, Marcus and I met once more. He slid the compiled dossier across the table. The binder was thick, heavy, the weight of years pressed into pages. He told me this was not just evidence, it was armor. He said the law can move slowly, but once set in motion, it is hard to stop. He asked me if I was ready. I thought of my father's flag, the medals stolen, the lies whispered behind closed doors, the hidden cameras staring at me in my sleep. I thought of the girl I had been, the soldier I had become, the veteran I now was, and I said yes. Marcus nodded. He called it the beginning of the end game. Walking out of that office, I felt the winter air cut sharp against my skin. The sky was wide, endless, and for the first time in a long while, I felt the horizon open instead of close. The counteroffensive was no longer a plan pinned to my wall. It was alive. Tomorrow, Clara and Victor would learn that the silence they had built their lies upon was shattered. Tomorrow, the fight would no longer be hidden in the corners of memory. It would stand in the open, where truth belongs. The morning of the hearing, I stood before the mirror in my small apartment, fastening the jacket of my dress uniform. The fabric was crisp, the brass polished, the patches aligned exactly where they belonged. I had not worn it since the day I retired, but I knew instinctively why Marcus wanted me to. It was not vanity, it was presence. The uniform carried weight. It told the court that I had served with discipline and honor, that I had carried my country's burden with steadiness, and that I was not here for spectacle. I was here for justice. Driving to the courthouse, I felt my chest tighten. My hand stayed steady on the wheel, but inside I could feel the 12-year-old girl stirring, the one who had once begged her mother for help that never came. I whispered to her that we were not walking in alone this time. We had allies, we had the hawk, and most importantly, we had truth. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and cold air. Clara sat at the opposite table, pearls at her throat, her hair styled just so. She looked every inch the grieving, misunderstood mother. Victor sat slumped beside her, his hands folded, his face drawn into lines of practiced remorse. I saw at once their strategy. She would perform innocence, he would perform frailty. It was a script they had written years ago, and they were ready to play it one more time. Marcus stood beside me like an anchor. He opened with precision, laying out the case as if briefing a mission. He presented exhibits A through M in order, walking the judge through the theft of the college fund, the defamatory calls, the archived emails, the testimony of neighbors and teachers, the recorded admission from Clara herself, and finally the hidden cameras confirmed by the technician. Each item was a strike, methodical, unhurried, undeniable. When it was my turn, I rose, my boots clicking against the polished floor. I had rehearsed my words 100 times, but standing there in uniform, I felt the gravity settle deeper. I spoke not as a wounded child, but as a soldier presenting an after-action report. I described the mission parameters, a household that should have been safe, a mother who chose silence, a stepfather who chose violence. I outlined the timeline, the key incidents, the evidence corroborating each one. My voice shook once, but I steadied it the way I had steadied my rifle years ago. Clara dabbed her eyes with a tissue, murmuring that I had misremembered, that trauma twists perception. Victor muttered that he had never laid a hand on me, his voice weak but rehearsed. Their lawyer echoed the performance, painting me as a bitter veteran clinging to old ghosts, and then Marcus called the witnesses. Jasmine took the stand first. She spoke with fire, describing the phone call she had received, the way Clara had warned her away from me. She held up the phone records as if they were dog tags, proof etched in ink. The judge leaned forward. Clara's smile faltered. Next came Captain Grace Thompson. Her voice was calm but steel-edged. She read aloud the email Clara had sent her years ago, the one warning that I was unstable. She looked straight at the judge and said she had never believed it for a second, that she had kept it knowing it might one day be needed to protect me. The courtroom went silent. Clara's face drained of color. Mrs. Lane followed, her hands trembling but her words steady. She admitted she had once believed Clara, that she had failed to see the truth, and that she would carry that regret always. She described how Clara had charmed her, how she had been manipulated into silence. Her honesty cut sharper than accusation. It showed the court not only what Clara had done, but how she had done it. By the time the Carsons testified about the shouting through the walls, I could feel the tide shifting. The web of lies was unraveling thread by thread. And then something happened I had not expected. When Marcus called the next witness, I turned and saw my younger brother Daniel walking down the aisle, my breath caught. For years he had been on Clara's side, repeating her words, believing her story. We had not spoken in nearly a decade. I had not asked him to be here. He took the stand, his face pale but determined. He said he had believed our mother for years, that he had thought I was dramatic, unstable, untrustworthy. He admitted he had repeated those lies to friends, to neighbors, even to Victor. But recently he had found Clara's handwritten notes in an old drawer, notes that scripted what he was supposed to say about me. He realized then that he had been used. His voice cracked as he said he was sorry. Exhibit N, testimony from Daniel Carter, once an ally of Clara, now confessing her deception. The room felt like it exhaled. Clara's face hardened, her eyes darting toward Daniel with fury barely hidden. Victor shifted but said nothing. For the first time, their performance faltered. Marcus leaned toward me and whispered, "The battle is turning." When the hearing broke for recess, I stepped into the hallway, my legs trembling with exhaustion. Daniel approached me cautiously, his eyes wet. He whispered that he had been blind, that he had wanted to believe her, that it had been easier than facing the truth. I told him we all choose our survival tools, and that sometimes survival means believing a lie. We stood there awkwardly, two siblings bound by years of silence, beginning to stitch something fragile together. Back inside, Marcus gave his closing like a commander rallying his troops. He said this was not just about family disputes. It was about coercive control, about the long shadow of abuse, about a veteran whose honor and safety had been stripped not on the battlefield but in her own home. He held up the binder of evidence and told the court that truth had weight, and today it was heavier than lies. As the judge prepared to deliver the ruling, I felt every muscle tighten. I remembered lying on the bedroom floor at 12 years old, ribs aching, begging for help that never came. I remembered writing my after-action report in solitude, pinning red threads that seemed meaningless at the time. And now here I stood, a soldier once more, not in desert fatigues, but in dress blues, my scars transformed into testimony. The courtroom was hushed when the judge returned. The sound of his robe brushing the chair seemed louder than any gavel. My heart thudded so hard I felt it in my throat. I sat with my spine straight, my uniform heavy but steadying. Marcus stood beside me, his presence like a shield. The judge began by summarizing the evidence. He spoke of the missing college fund, the bank slips in Clara's handwriting, the defamatory calls and emails, the testimony of Jasmine Grace, Mrs. Lane, the Carsons, and finally my brother Daniel. He noted the technician's report confirming surveillance cameras hidden in my room. His words were clinical, stripped of emotion, but each one cut through the performance Clara had staged. Clara sat stiff, her hands clasped tight in her lap. Victor slumped further, his head bowed as if he could disappear into the wood grain of the table. The judge said the court found clear and convincing evidence of abuse, coercive control, financial exploitation, and defamation. He ordered an immediate restraining order against both Clara and Victor. They were barred from contacting me directly or indirectly. He mandated restitution for the stolen funds, adjusted for interest, and damages for defamation. And though it was not prison, he declared on record that their actions met the threshold of psychological abuse. Hearing the words aloud was like standing under a wave. For years I had carried the silence, doubting my own memories. Now a judge had spoken the truth I had long whispered to myself. Abuse, coercive control, defamation. Words I had feared would never be acknowledged were now carved into the record. Clara's face cracked for the first time, her lips trembled, her eyes darted, her composure splintered. Victor mumbled something about misunderstanding, but no one listened. The gavel fell and the trial was over. I exhaled, a sound I had been holding in for years. Marcus put a hand briefly on my shoulder and whispered, "You fought well. The hawk had led the mission, but the battle had been mine." Afterward, in the courthouse steps, Daniel approached me again. The cameras from local press were gone. This was not the kind of case that drew headlines. It was quieter than that, more ordinary, more devastating. He looked at me with eyes heavy from years of denial. He said he was sorry again. But this time he asked if I could ever forgive him. I told him forgiveness is not a switch, not something you flip on command. It is a process, a campaign of its own. But I told him I was willing to try. His shoulders sagged with relief, and in that moment I saw the boy I had once played catch with in the yard, long before Clara had poisoned the air between us. That night I went home to my apartment and stood in front of the war room one last time. The red threads, the photos, the exhibits, they had been my lifeline, my way of bringing order to chaos. Now they looked different. They were not just fragments of pain pinned to cork. They were proof of survival, evidence of resilience. I thought of dismantling it, but instead I left it up, not as a wound, but as a monument. I sat with the flag case on my lap. My father's flag had never been recovered, but I held the empty case as if it carried his presence. I whispered that I had fought a different kind of war, one he never lived to see, and though I had not brought home his medals, I had brought home the truth. Sleep came easier that night. For the first time in decades, I was not listening for footsteps in the hallway, not scanning for hidden eyes in the walls. I lay down knowing that the law had spoken, that Clara's manipulations had been exposed, that Victor's denials had been stripped bare. In the weeks that followed, I kept busy with paperwork, restitution, and counseling appointments arranged through the Veterans Network. Marcus stayed in touch, his voice steady as always. He reminded me that victory is never perfect, that scars remain, but he also reminded me that survival itself is a form of triumph. One afternoon, Jasmine called just to say she was proud of me. Another day, Grace sent me a note that simply read, "Stand tall, Sergeant, even Mrs." Lane mailed another letter, saying the outcome gave her a measure of peace. These small gestures stitched together something I had thought was gone: community. Daniel began visiting. Slowly, carefully, we began talking not about the past, but about the future. About jobs, about his kids, about the way silence had nearly broken us both. There were still sharp edges, but there was also the possibility of healing. I learned something in those weeks. Justice is not a single moment when a gavel falls. It is a slow rebuilding, a steady process of reclaiming space inside yourself that once belonged to fear. It is waking up without dread. It is standing in front of your war room and realizing it is no longer a map of battle, but a record of victory. One evening, I walked to the park near my apartment. The air was cool, the sun dipping low. Families laughed, children ran, a dog barked in the distance. Ordinary sounds, ordinary peace. I realized then that ordinary is what I had been fighting for all along. Not glory, not revenge for its own sake, but the chance to live without chains. I am not naive. I know Clara will never see herself as guilty. I know Victor will likely fade into his own silence without ever admitting what he did. But their power is gone, their reach has been cut off, and my voice, once buried, has risen. When I tell this story now, I tell it not as a tragedy, but as a testament to every soldier who has fought battles both abroad and at home, a testament to the strength it takes to speak when silence seems safer, a testament to the truth that even the smallest allies, a friend, a teacher, a brother who finally chooses honesty, can change the tide. The war room still stands in my apartment. Sometimes I glance at it and smile, not because of the pain it represents, but because it reminds me of the mission completed. Every thread is a line of survival, every photo a reminder that lies can be dismantled, every document a marker that justice is possible. I am Staff Sergeant Emily Carter, retired United States Army. I have fought enemies with rifles and enemies with words. I have faced violence in deserts far from home, and I have faced violence in the house where I was raised. And I have learned that courage does not always roar. Sometimes it stands quietly in a courtroom, wearing a uniform, telling the truth out loud. This was my final battle, and I won. When the trial was over and the courthouse faded into memory, I went back to my apartment and stood before the war room one last time. The photos, the red threads, the taped statements, the evidence that had carried me through the storm. For months it had been my battlefield. Now it was time to lay down those weapons. I pulled each pin from the corkboard, each photo, each paper. I stacked them carefully into a locked box, not to erase the past, but to protect it. The truth no longer needed to hang on my wall. It was written in the record, spoken in the courtroom, carried in the voices of my allies. For the first time, I felt the difference between surviving and moving forward. But I knew my story was not the only one. In the weeks that followed, women began reaching out. Veterans who had carried their own battles home, who had faced violence not on foreign soil, but in their own kitchens and living rooms. Their words echoed mine. Their silences heavier than body armor. I realized then that healing could not be a solitary act. We needed a unit. So I began Homefront Sisters, a circle for women veterans who had survived family abuse. We met in small rooms, church basements, borrowed spaces, wherever we could gather. We shared stories without judgment. We listened to each other's silences. We built trust the way we once built formations, step by step, side by side. What started as a handful grew into dozens. Survivors who had been invisible found strength in being seen. One night after a meeting, I sat alone with my father's flag case. The cloth was still folded sharp, corners perfect, a soldier's honor preserved even when his body was gone. I took a sheet of paper and folded it carefully, crease after crease, until a crane emerged in my hands, a paper bird, fragile yet steady. I placed it on the flag, a small symbol of peace, of truth reclaimed, of resilience that could bend but not break. I looked around my apartment and felt something settle. The war room was gone, but I was not unarmed. My strength was no longer pinned on a wall. It lived inside me in the stories of my sisters, in the paper crane resting on the folded flag. If you are listening and my story touched something in you, remember this. Courage is not always about standing tall in battle. Sometimes it is about standing steady in court. Sometimes it is about whispering your truth to one trusted friend. And sometimes it is about choosing to heal, even when healing feels impossible. If Emily's story moved you, like this video, subscribe to Military Revenge and share your own one-word memory in the comments. Together, we build a platoon where every story is heard and no warrior fights alone.